This is Elected, a podcast for women in and around politics and our active accomplices. I'm your host, Sarah Elder Chaminara, and today my guest is NDP MLA for Manitoba, Lisa Naylor. In the spirit of reconciliation, it's important to me to share my personal commitment to learning the history of colonialism and the ongoing systemic violence and oppression against Indigenous peoples. The land where I live, work, and record from is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, Stoney Nakoda Nations, Métis Nation Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, Sarah. It's so nice to meet you finally, virtually. Yeah.
Yes.
And I appreciate that land acknowledgement. If I may, I would like to also acknowledge the land that I'm speaking to you from today. I'm talking to you from my constituency office in Winnipeg, and that's located on Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene people. And it is also the homeland of the Red River Métis.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that. And your riding is, I was looking at a map. It is like would you say it's the heart of Winnipeg?
I would say that it's one of two constituencies that would be kind of the very center of the city. So Union Station, which is the constituency to the west, to the east of me, is kind of the downtown core of the city, and then I neighbor right next by. And our two constituencies are geographically the smallest, but we also have a high population density.
Yes. Who's your neighboring MLA?
So Zoma Asakwera is Union Station, my neighbor to the west. And sorry, I keep saying that to my neighbor to the east. Mm-hmm. Adrian Sala is the MLA in St. James, my neighbor to the west. And then to the north, I have Malaya Marcelino. So I'm surrounded by my NDP colleagues. We make up a lot of the core area of the city.
Well, that tells you exactly where the NDP strength then lays in Winnipeg. Yeah. Before we get into politics, I just want to, so you have a really, one of those careers that I think just, ties in perfectly in terms of, what we need. We need more people in politics who come from a diversity of backgrounds, but yours from a professional aspect. So you worked in social services in really different aspects. So counseling, education, advocacy, public policy, and then but before that, after that, you've served as a school division trustee before making the switch to provincial politics. I know that's like a very, 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 very high level kind of overview of like decades worth of work. But I'm so interested in talking with you today, not only because you're actually, I was going to say unfortunately, but you are the second NDP Manitoba MLA, because I had the good fortune of talking with your colleague, Nahanni Fontaine, last year. And so, I feel like coming from BC, I mean, politically in Canada, the outsides of the country, or not even the outsides, but the kind of like inner outsides politically get the most attention. And then us on the inside, on the prairie part of it, don't necessarily get the attention, or the people don't know enough about what's happening in the prairie provinces. So I'm excited to talk to you about that today too. So tell me, how did you make the switch from being in social services to, jumping to school trustee and then provincially?
Sure, I'd be happy to talk about that. The school trustee thing, I wasn't thinking about it as politics, which maybe seems a little bit strange, but I just, in my mind, city councillors, MLAs, MPP or MPs, like those, that was politics. To me, deciding to run for the school board just had a lot to do with thinking about the influence of, obviously it seems so obvious now, it is about politics because it was about influencing policy, right? But I wasn't coming at it sort of thinking about a career in politics. I didn't leave my counseling job. School trustees are a very part-time job, at least here in Manitoba. And I had a friend who had served for 12 years and she told me to consider running. And it actually happened. Not many people know this story, but my daughter had just started grade 7. She was at a new school and something like really unfortunate happened on her first day in her gym class. And some of the comments that were made by the two phys ed teachers to some of the girls, it was really like, it was body shaming. It was like centering girls out around like their bra straps showing, that kind of thing. And at the time I was writing a blog, writing a blog on issues around self-esteem and body image. So I actually wrote a blog post on this. And then I also wrote a letter to the principal. And I didn't know the girl who was targeted by the remarks, but I ended up getting a call from kind of a friend of the parent who did know me, who was like, I saw that, can I send that? Anyways, it kind of got a little bigger. And this friend who was on the school board, spoke to the superintendent about it. It all got sorted out. There was apologies and things changed. But that friend came to me and said, you really should run for the school board because I'm stepping down after 12 years. And at the time, I also working as a counselor with teens in community health and having done a lot of sexual health education and other health education and body image work and self-esteem work. Like I'd done a lot in those years. I just felt like that was a voice of when I looked at who was on the school board, there wasn't kind of that voice there. And Winnipeg School Division is very strong in this area, but you still need the people making decisions about the budget to say this is important, right? So that was really what prompted me to run. And I did, it was after my first term, as I was preparing to run for my second term, right around the end of my first 4-year term, that the MLA in my constituency announced he wouldn't be running again. And Rob Altemeyer served for 16 years. So there was never really a time in that time that there seems like an opening for anyone to do something there. And I kept saying, like, we have to, like, Rob was great, but we need a strong woman. We need like a strong wife. Wolseley can, actually, I used to say all the time, Wolseley can't elect a woman. Nobody can. Mm-hmm. And so then people started coming to me and that was where I was like, oh, okay. I hadn't really thought about this. And I was getting ready to run for my second term. It wasn't, I hadn't thought about changing my life in that kind of a way. I was already in my 50s. I had been at my women's health clinic for long enough. I could have had a full pension at 57. I kind of had a vision for what I would do after that. When I had that safety net, I pictured myself like getting a job in the poverty sector, somewhere where people couldn't pay very much, but I would be like, that'll be okay because I have this other income and I would still be young enough to want to work. So I've always had a long-term plan. So it was very disruptive to my long-term plan, but there was a lot of conversations with a lot of really wonderful people who helped me think about what that might look like and why I might be the right person to serve in this position. So I threw my hat in the ring and it was actually a pretty hotly contested nomination race, which I won in May of 2019 and was mentally preparing for an election in 2020. But the government called it, like, we have a set election date. And Brian Pallister called the election almost 14 months early. So bam, I ran, I won, and here we are.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot.
But what really interests, there's a lot that you said that I want to kind of talk about, but also, I think about it from the perspective of someone who's maybe listening, who also works in, the social services sector or the, it's often called the nonprofit, but there's actually, the profit that comes from the nonprofit sector is actually extremely significant. So I also call it this, what other people do is the social profit sector. And, if they are like, well, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not in business, I don't, I'm not seen as maybe, one of those traditional kind of like pipeline jobs into politics, but you had that. It was the perfect complement, because going from, working on those issues to then being a school trustee, and you're right, budget decisions that are made often are about issues of that, that you were working on as a in the social services sector. What would you say to someone else who thinks maybe like, oh, I'm not in the quote unquote right profession to make that leap into politics? What would you say to that person?
Well, that is interesting to hear that question, because I kind of get it more now that is what are considered the traditional routes. There are not many people who serve in the Manitoba legislature who have the background that you're talking about. I don't know, I could be wrong on this, but I think my colleague, Mark Wolseley, might be the only lawyer background. There could be someone on the PC side that I'm not aware of. But some of the role models, some of the women that I knew as kind of the strongest power person, like people that I, have looked up to and emulated in my work and knew of their work at the time, were Jennifer Howard. And she'd been the director of Women's Health Clinic where I had worked. She'd done some policy work under the Gary Deere government as well. And Teresa Oswald was a teacher. They were two of the women that I, who were ministers, who I was most aware of their work. And so I didn't really think about it like that. But I mean, certainly if someone, I don't think it hurts to have a background in public policy. I admire my colleague, Malaya Marcelino. She doesn't have a long work history, but man, does she know her policy work. And she's such a researcher. And, we have such different skills and knowledge base that we bring to the table and share with each other. So I think the diversity of experiences that are in the room are really what matter, right? And I think that regardless of the background anyone comes from, it's very helpful to be able to know how to like read research and to understand policies and complexities of, the impact on people. And the other thing I would say, honestly, probably one of the biggest, most important lessons from us during the pandemic was sitting at our caucus table with, our 18 opposition members, and thinking about our responses to various announcements that were coming up very quickly and sometimes not quickly enough in response to all kinds of aspects of the pandemic. And there was one in particular about like this shift to online schooling. And it was really debated in our caucus room because, there was a lot of people with young parents who wanted that, right? That was like, that felt safe, keep my kids home. But there was also all these voices in the room of people like myself who, I'd worked with so many kids who, both as a school trustee, but also in my counseling role, whose families didn't have the internet, right? Who didn't have that kind of access. And there was such diversity of voices at the table to everything we responded to that we just sometimes would literally say, can you imagine this conversation in the government, like at the cabinet table? Because we knew that there was not the same kind of broad experience, whether it was cultural. I mean, we had people speaking to what folks in the Sikh community were thinking, what people in the Filipino community were thinking, like various African communities, inner city. We just were able to bring all of those voices, and certainly the impact. And we have a sitting MLA who was a chief and still lives on his reserve, right? Oh, actually two now, because we had a by-election. So folks that could speak to real world issues from that, very diverse backgrounds. And so, I mean, that's what I would point to and say that's exactly who we need in the legislature. We're there, there's a lot of stuff to learn for sure. And if you don't, for someone like me who didn't have a education in political science, but you know what, there's so much, like, I can read, right? That stuff's learnable.
Well, they give you a handbook, right?
Yeah.
There's a book.
School,
yes.
MLA school. And actually, I think probably because of the pandemic, the Commonwealth Commonwealth associations, so like all the Commonwealth countries, like we all have access to all this online learning now that wasn't available before. So it's some of it I know now because I've been in this role for 3 years, but other stuff I've signed up for some courses just to understand a little more broadly how certain things work. And then we get coached through everything. You know, we have a brilliant house leader, and you met my colleague Nahani Fontaine, and they can, you know, who's available to like walk all the MLAs through some of the things we don't necessarily know when we first get elected.
You're exactly right. And I feel like it's kind of like looking at a job description and thinking like, oh, you know, like there are the aspects of any job, some you learn once you start, but what you're bringing to it is your core set of skills that makes you absolutely unique and what makes you the most qualified. And that you complement, you know, hopefully everyone else that you're working with. But to your point, you know, that's like so vitally and critically important, is that you had that diversity of opinion and thought and that those conversations. And you're right, it doesn't necessarily happen, you know, at cabinet tables or in premier's offices or, you know, even in opposition caucus rooms, because excuse me, it really depends on the people in the room, and it depends on, you know, how a political party comes at even recognizing the issue that this is, you know, we do need to have a diversity of people around to make better decisions. So when you were going through those discussions during the pandemic, did you see the government respond what was that like in terms of, you know, working with them or against, like, you know, because every province had a really different kind of way of going at it. Some provinces, like in BC, there was kind of more of a, you know, they would do like, you know, calls together and, you know, showed a little bit of like, they showed cooperation at times of, whereas here in Alberta, there was nothing like that. What was it like in Manitoba?
I think closer to what happened in Alberta. During the main first part of the pandemic, obviously we're still in it, but so Brian Pallister was the premier at the time. And, you know, as you likely know, he stepped down from that role for any number of reasons that we have some ideas about. But, you know, I think Brian's style was to, you know, I guess one way we've talked about it is that as a premier, he said what he was going to do and he did those things. And then he left and people didn't like it, but he actually did what he said he was going to do. And he was like a more autocratic leader. And we've heard that even from members of his team. He had a cabinet minister step down not that long before he resigned because she didn't like the direction. It was particularly related to her file on Indigenous relations and some of the racism that was being perpetrated, not just by the premier, but also by a cabinet member. And so, you know, that was like, that's a part of his style and who he was. He wasn't someone who really took a lot of direction from a lot of people. And it seemed from the things we have observed, obviously I was not close in that space, but that he, you know, had a couple of trusted people that really were directing where things were going, and that he may have had a little bit more voices at the table and diversity at the table, but he wasn't listening to it. So, and nobody was listening to the opposition. So I do think we did have some wins along the way, in part because we were able to engage the citizens of Manitoba to push back on some issues, and that, you know, what we were able to make some changes over those couple of years. And we were able to have, you know, a few briefings here and there with the chief medical officer, but for the most part, decisions, you know, were just announced to Manitobans without a lot of consultation or discussion with the opposition.
Yeah, I don't, obviously, to your point, we're still in the pandemic, so I'm not sure at what point we'll ever maybe even be out of it, but it'll be interesting, I think, when we do get to a point where, you know, we can reflect back on how things worked and, you know, even by, how different cities responded, but as well as different provinces. And, hopefully there are definitely lessons to be learned. It's whether we take them or not and apply them to future issues. But for the most part, like I think that, on so much of the political conversation right now in Canada is being occupied by, a federal leadership contest. We have a provincial leadership contest here for someone who will go on to be premier. BC NDP also have a leadership contest, which we'll see a new premier. But I don't think, Manitoba kind of, with the exception of, frequently when he was still in office, hearing about Brian Palliser's remote work and living in, I think is it Costa Rica? Manitoba flies under the political radar to some degree outside of maybe Manitoba. But so what do you want people who are listening from another province to know about, the issues that are important to Manitobans and what we need to care about more to understand Manitoba better?
Sure. Well, I think one of the reasons that flies under the radar for the rest of the country is that just our population is small. And so, I originally came from Ontario. Living in Toronto, the population of one city was far bigger than the population of this province. And so I guess I can, theoretically understand why the issues in Manitoba might seem less important or be less on the radar across the country. But having said that, I think geographically, we are the center of the country. We have a lot of unique and important perspectives in terms of, having a large urban center where a lot of decisions take place, but also we have this huge province with rural areas and the far north, right? And we have folks that are very much a part of our province and very much a part of our country, who live, hours and hours and hours and hours away, flying communities, that kind of thing, or driving in when there's winter roads. And to me, it's a bit of a microcosm because I think a lot of provinces have that, but I think we're in some ways a little bit more able to pay attention to that range and that diversity. I don't know how many people sitting around, the provincial legislature in Ontario are really thinking about what's happening in Kenora or Thunder Bay, right? And those or like Wawa, I don't have a sense of that. Whereas I know that in our legislature, it rarely a day goes by that there isn't a reference to something happening in the northern and rural and more remote parts as well of our province. And that's partly because the MLAs who, are strong representatives for those areas keep that in the forefront. But I do see us, I feel like we're very, that smaller population does allow us to pay attention across the board to a broad range of issues if we're willing, right? If the government of the day is willing and interested to do that. That right now, the 4 MLAs that represent Northern Manitoba are all in opposition with me. So we'll see what happens if there's a change of government in 2023. This province, unlike a lot of the rest of the country, has primarily gone between a Conservative and an NDP government throughout, kind of historically. And so whereas, the Liberal Party factors in a much more significant way where I came from in Ontario, it's like right now the Liberal members in the legislature sit as independents because there's not enough of them to have official party status in the legislature. So it's a little bit of a two-party system here in many ways, not that my Liberal colleagues would want to hear me say that, but that's the reality of how things operate right now. So that's probably different than in some other places or where there's maybe 2 opposition parties. It changes, I think in some ways that makes it a little bit harder to do some of the collaborative work that can happen when two parties might work together in order to push some legislation through, even if they're not in government. So yeah, I don't know. I hope I answered your question. I do tend to go off on different trains.
No. I appreciate it because it's interesting to hear, and I don't think there's any right or wrong way to, answer something, but that rural aspect is definitely 100% because the urban centers, for the most part, because that's where the greatest concentrations of people are, get a lot of the attention. But the issues facing anyone who lives in a northern area, and what we even describe in Canada is north, is so funny. I was having a conversation yesterday with someone from who immigrated to Canada from Slovakia, and we were talking about he was like, I drew a circumference around the size of Alberta, but I put it on a map of Europe. And I put, the center in Slovakia, and he was like, he was so, his eyes were just like, when he had that moment of realization about how large, the provinces in Canada are, and he was just blown away by the size. But that size also, I think, is, we're used to it, but also, the attention that gets paid to rural issues is obviously, in my opinion, it's never enough. Mm-hmm. And then, but also, the challenges of a rural MLA versus an urban MLA is that they have so much territory to cover. Right. And access and driving and flights, it's a lot. And that gets really glossed over in terms of, the work of those MLAs and even MPs, when you're having to take, 2, maybe even 3 flights to get to Ottawa versus, someone who, hops on a short flight from Toronto or, however they get there, the train. It's totally different.
Yeah, I think that's true. People don't realize that the job itself really varies depending on where it's happening, right? And I see that with my colleagues. And we have all the events that are happening this summer that because we're a year out from an election, we're making so much effort for our team to be at all these things, but it's obviously not feasible for our northern team members to be down in the city for all the different events that we think are important. And it's also not feasible for us to be able to support them at as many of their events as we would like to. But, it's also critical to remember how much of our economy is in Manitoba is centered both in the north because of mining and, mineral extraction, but also in agriculture. That is a really important part of the Manitoba economy. And so the producers and farmers and folks across the province need to have their voice heard and represented in the legislature in a really strong way as well.
Yeah. Well, you hit on an interesting point with the mineral extraction, because obviously Alberta is, we're kind of into that, into extraction of natural resources. And, different parts, if you go outside of, it's more of a northern issue, definitely in BC, there's a lot of that as well. A lot of farming and a lot of different things that go on in a lot of different provinces, but how our country is kind of responding to that is obviously, different. Do you, in terms of your work with the federal party, do you get a lot of support from them, especially now in the lead up to an election?
The NDP federal party, that. We definitely had some support in the 2019 election. I know Jim Mead was out here. It also overlapped with the federal election. So it's hard to say how, they were happening kind of at the same time. So that was a little tricky. I know that, I know our leader has a great relationship with the leader of the federal NDP. But we're not, as a provincial party, we're very independent from the federal party, and we make our own policy decisions based on the needs of Manitobans.
Yeah, I'd say the same as in Alberta. That there are obviously areas where they are aligned, but also ones that are different. And in a country of our size, that, it would be hard to have the same policies. For the same, every province is just so dramatically different.
Right. And provincial legislatures are making different laws than
Mhm.
federal legislators. And we are, we have like our needs are very local, really. And so, I think in a dream world, if we had an NDP federal government and a Manitoba, like a NDP provincial government, I'm sure we could do some wonderful things together. But at this point, our focus is quite local on the things that need to happen here. And obviously, we hope to win government in 2023.
So you talked about summer events and that you've already, you're ramping up your presence and your efforts. Have you already started nominations? Where's the party in terms of getting ready?
Yeah, a lot of our candidates have been nominated. We went out really early last fall because we didn't trust that the government wasn't going to call another early election. We didn't really know what was going to happen with their leadership race. And, if would the new premier come in and just call an election, what might have happened? Honestly, that probably would have been to their advantage when people were happy to see the back of Premier Pallister. But at this point, I don't think it's in their best interest to go early. So it's, we can't predict what they're going to do. But I was renominated in December. So incumbents were, we were set some specific targets that we had to meet in terms of fundraising and membership and that kind of thing. So almost all of our incumbents have been renominated, and we have a number, not all, but a number of our candidates in other constituencies have been nominated as well. We also there was a by-election in, it's all a blur now, maybe February. Like I remember canvassing in the winter, and February maybe was the by-election before we went back into the legislature in March. So it wasn't an area that's been traditionally, kind of a safe PC seat, but it was also a really great opportunity for us to train up new volunteers, to get like, even the person who I think is going to manage my campaign next time was able to, get a lot of really good training on that. So that was helpful. But now there's another by-election. They've had a resignation of, this will be our third by-election. And so the first one was like Brian Pallister's resignation. The second one was in Thompson. And sadly, I don't know if you read in the news, but our colleague was killed in a car accident in December. And so Danielle, that by-election was held more recently. And now there is another one to replace a cabinet minister who stepped down recently and left his position, left his seat as an MLA he said, to go work in the private sector. So the by-elections take a lot of time and energy. They're obviously nobody's favorite thing, especially when we do have, other work to do, but that's also a bit of our focus right now.
And for example, because I'm from BC, I know that BC, and now I'm Albertan, but the BC NDP has an equity policy for candidates in ridings where the incumbent MLA steps down. How does the Manitoba NDP approach that equity piece with elections and candidates?
Yeah, we do have a policy in terms of we're working towards equity in terms of representation, so that we have at least 50% women, and also we want representation from non-binary folks in the legislature as well. I'm familiar with that BC policy. I'm not sure that we actually have that policy. And partly right now, all the incumbents are running again. So that hasn't been on my radar. I just don't know if that's part of the party policy. But I know how hard we're working to have female candidates. And we do at every constituency association, there's like a minimum, even at the time when I was approached, I think it's at least five women have to be approached and tried, convinced to try to run and like that kind of thing. And we're having conversations about what kind of resources and supports might be necessary to support women and non-binary people to run. How do we have to approach these things differently? Right now, 1/3 of the the MLAs in the NDP side of the house are women or non-binary, where it's almost exactly the same number as they have in the PC side of the house, even though they have double members, right? So I definitely want to see that. I want to obviously have more women in the legislature. I think that's very important.
Yeah, definitely. Has it been, you have Heather Stephenson now in Manitoba. How has it, do you hear from people? Do people talk about, do they treat, how they approach the leadership of her versus Palace? And obviously they're very different people, but do you hear people talk about that, or is it an issue, do you think, for Manitobans in electing?
Because she's a woman?
Yeah.
The PCs, of course, were very excited to have their first female premier, and paid a lot of attention to that, and rightfully so. I can absolutely appreciate that. I think, unfortunately, there's been a lot of blunders along the way, and Premier Stephenson hasn't come across as the most compassionate leader, and I don't know if expectations are higher because she's a woman that she would be more compassionate, but she's following on the heels of somebody who's really not seen as compassionate, and she's seen as less compassionate. And that's what I hear at the doorstep. That's, a lot of people's frustration. And so, it would be naive to suggest that sexism doesn't play into that, but I'm also aware of the mistakes that have been made and things that have been said. She told Manitobans word for word they were on their own, kind of when it came to the pandemic, that the government wasn't going to make any more, have any more health. What's the word I want? I don't
restrictions.
I don't use restrictions.
Okay.
I say health protection.
Okay.
So in that context,
yeah.
That's how I've been talking about it since the beginning of the pandemic, right?
That's a great, if only we had started using that 2+ years ago.
Yeah, because I think the whole narrative of restrictions and mandates and all of that language, but to, as someone who's worked in community health, in social services aspect of community health, but also for years and years and years of harm reduction, to me, these are just harm reduction, health protection strategies.
It's preventative.
Yes, and we always should have framed it that way. But in the context of removing the last of those protections, Heather said, Manitobans, you're on your own. And people didn't like to hear that. They wanted the leadership of, to be fair, even Brian Pallister, it seemed to care sometimes when he spoke, right? We've seen in Ontario where, Premier Ford, for all his conservative policies and how much a lot of Ontarians didn't appreciate him, we heard him say compassionate things that made it sound like he cared about the people who he was responsible for, right? And so Premier Stephenson hasn't come across in that way. But, for me, the whole conversation about women in politics, and I know, I love you, I love what you do, I love Madam Premier, I love the whole generic idea of women in politics without, being nonpartisan. And there's other organizations working on getting women elected. And I was recently at a conference for the Commonwealth Women, where it was all just very general about women. But what the struggle for me in that is that my feminism and my values about women in leadership from my entire life have never been about one individual in power. It's never been about personal power. I didn't run to make my life better. In fact, I kind of went kicking and screaming. I was like, but I get that pension.
Well, you had your plan.
I love my job. I love my, I didn't have a reason to leave it. Right. But my values are about making the world better for women and obviously for non-binary, trans folks, for children, for anybody who has less than, that equal piece of the pie, right? In every part of society. And so for me, it's not enough to be a woman in leadership. You need to be a woman who wants to make the world better for women and who has that as a motivating factor. And so that's where I kind of I have a hard time diving into that whole, like, let's just elect women. Right? Obviously we should, and there should be as many women's voices in the room as men's voices, absolutely. And getting off the binary, like, there needs to be diversity across the board. But I also want to elect women who want to make policy that make sure women and children are okay. Because we know it in other countries. We've seen the research. When women and children are educated, safe, fed, housed, the whole society is better, right? And I think that's what we need to focus on here as well, right? All of our society will be better when women and children are safe and clothed and fed and housed and have what they need to thrive.
Yeah. And I spend a lot of time thinking about just this because, I mean, I spend a lot of time. This occupies a great portion of my mind because to your point, I mean, think about it. There are so many examples. Let's use, there are a lot of women in politics who I don't even agree with, but also have approaches that are definitely, in my opinion, anti-woman, anti-family, inclusive, just straight up because they'll say, like, I'm against abortion, I'm against same-sex marriage, intersectionality is like, what's that? And I'm going to make, a joke about it. And this is a conversation I would love to have more of, because I think we need to have it. It can also be uncomfortable and controversial even. Who you vote for, whoever they are, but obviously I want more women to be elected and obviously non-binary people as well, but who you vote for really matters, and what they believe in has to align with what you want them to, you have to be in support of that. And so, that piece about who you elect and what they do with the power that they have is really critical. Because, we could invite, imagine we could have an entire legislature filled with women, but what happens if those women are, what, in terms of the policies that they're creating and the politics that they have, is it, what does it mean? What does it look like? And does it harm women? Danielle Smith, who's running for the leadership of the UCP here in Alberta, and seems to be on track to actually win, has some incredibly dangerous views on things that she's talked about around cancer. She, has talked about her use, when she was still a radio host, about, using ivermectin as a COVID treatment. She's talked about her first act as, if she's elected, about being apologizing to the pastors who had been arrested for breaching and breaking laws put in place during protections for COVID. Creating what she calls the Alberta Sovereignty Act. So basically, Alberta not any law that Ottawa makes, we'll just say, that's not for us. We're just not going to do it, setting us up for a huge constitutional crisis in Alberta in the lead up to a 2023 election, where this is all going to be up for grabs again. Is that what I want? Do you vote for her just because she's a woman? Absolutely. And some people, and then that piece of the conversation around and I get this a lot. It's like, so you want me just to vote for someone because they're a woman? No, I want you to vote for them because they are a woman and they're the most qualified person. But also, are you in your own, like, are you checking your own unconscious bias as well as your own conscious bias around how you're framing this as an issue just based on what you consider to be gender? Like, there's so much to unpack about it.
Yeah, and absolutely. And what you're describing sounds terrifying to me. My in-laws are in Alberta, and I don't like what I'm hearing. But I will say that, I would be thrilled if our whole legislature was filled with women, even though we would be still coming from very diverse political views and goals in the world. And I absolutely know that women have as much, if not more, to offer than men do when it comes to social policy, every like fiscal policy. Women have all the talent and all the knowledge and all the experience to bring to that table. And I think that, I think there should be, obviously, it's not about just, if I had two candidates in front of me who were equally skilled, I would always choose the woman first. That's really important to me, at any level of government. But I also care about skills and experience and what people are bringing to the table. And I think it is a tricky balance. But I think that I think where women haven't been elected, in part, there is still that unconscious bias where people don't necessarily think that a woman can do it. I heard your interview. I've forgotten her name, the Liberal candidate in Ontario, who everyone kept asking her how old she was, right? She was like 39 or something.
Kate Gibbs. Yes.
And we have men in our legislature in their 20s, it's like that whole idea of, that somehow you're going to be successful as a woman, that you have to be, I don't know, so much older, have had decades of career experience, that kind of thing is wrong. We have to shift all that. And it's not just women. I mean, to me, it's so important, the representation that we have from Indigenous people in our legislature, from Black people. It took till 2019 for Manitoba to elect its first Black MLA. And 3 Black MLAs were elected, and on both sides of the House. And that's very important, because we don't move forward as a society or create a society that is safe and healthy and can grow economically and be a place that many of us want to live without having that diversity represented at every place where decisions are made, at council table and in the legislature and in Ottawa. But I still think that there's still just that tricky challenge for me that women, I guess I have a higher expectation and standard, and some of the men I work with have dedicated their lives to making decisions that make the world better for people, right? And so I wouldn't want to lose their voices either. But could I handle being a legislature with all women? That would be an interesting day. When we get to that we get to the kind of equity where that stops becoming important. But it's not going to stop for a really long time. I've been in spaces for a very long time, working towards different types of equity, and it seems to take forever.
Well, and it's so interesting to even just visualize, a legislature anywhere, or the House of Commons filled with entirely women. It seems absurd to even, think about it, and just, it would be amazing. But at the same time, contrast that with like literal actual history where legislatures in the House of Commons, every level of government, it's been entirely men, or has been for so long.
Yeah,
and that seems for decades. And that seems, when you visualize that, it's completely normal.
Yeah. Yeah. And primarily white men, well,
yes.
Right. So, I did hear one of your interviews and heard that there are no Indigenous people in the Alberta legislature. And that's heartbreaking to me. I don't know. I know there are a couple of Métis MLAs on the other side of the House. I'm not totally familiar with all the PC's background, but at this point, 6 of our caucus of 18 are Indigenous. And I can't actually imagine now being in a group of people making policy together that didn't have that kind of representation of our province.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem, and
Mhm.
it's one that absolutely has to be addressed. I think, for me, I think political parties have to, first of all, acknowledge that there's a problem or there's an issue, however you want challenge, however you want to phrase it, that, but that also the electorate has an expectation, and not only the electorate, but I think also there has to be a push within caucuses, and even when within groups of candidates, if you're even considering running for a party, you're asking, well, who else is going to be running alongside me? Because that matters to me. And then because I feel like it has to be like such a concerted effort to, if a party, for example, is reluctant to do those things, like if they're not going to do it, then those forces have to come externally to kind of, to make that push happen. Because you're absolutely right. In 2022, like it shouldn't have been a 2020 or even a 2018 or a 2010. Like these, it's as much as we celebrate the election of the first person from different backgrounds, but like when we get to the point where it's the 10th or the 19th, or like can we just make that rapid change happen as quickly as possible, because it should have already happened. But obviously there are a lot of reasons and a lot of forces at play that want to maintain the status quo.
And the space that we're electing people into is still misogynist, is still racist. And I mean, I witness that. I sit with my colleagues and feel that, sometimes for myself as a woman, but for my non-binary colleague, for my Indigenous colleagues, some of the things that are said and heard, some of the policies that are created that completely ignore the realities of non-white folks, non-rich white folks, depending on what the policy is. That is one of the challenges to that diversity, is who wants to willingly step into that space. And it's exhausting to be in that space and have those kinds of experiences happen when it's very different being in our constituencies for the most part. Not that nobody experiences racism or misogyny in their constituencies, but most of us who are elected there have good relationships within our constituencies and can connect with the people that we serve and enjoy the events and be, hear people and help their problems. That's what we're there for. But when we step into those sacred hallowed halls that have these years and years of history that supported, like there was a reason it was only white men in those spaces for so long. Everything was built to support that. And so it is a constant challenge to be in that space and work and bring your best self every day.
Yeah, the spaces have to change. They have to evolve at the same time that politics evolves. Otherwise, as we've seen political, I'm thinking about even like Annamie Paul federally for the Greens, and Indigenous MPs, and they've talked about it. They've said like they've been targeted by building security, and racism within their within the institutions and their own parties. And when people leave politics because the institutions and the parties and the systems don't change and adapt to where we are in 2022, that's a huge problem. And what has changed?
Right.
Not the spaces don't change, the people leave, the good people leave. And then those communities, don't have that voice. And where do we end up? Back at the same place somewhat? I don't know. Like these are conversations that I love to have.
Clearly, which is why you're doing this podcast.
Yes.
Great.
Well, because, there's so many things, and it's hard to have conversations like this on Twitter, for example. You really can't for the most part. People are looking to, say like gotcha, or it's, it's just really hard, and tone and all of those different things. And so, yeah, um, this podcast, I hope is a place for, well, not, and it's not even about like always agreeing. It's also like, I don't necessarily agree. I've disagreed with different people on different things, on like electoral reform, for example, or, but having those conversations and, and understanding each other better, and being able to do those things respectfully. And also, I think coming from the place of, like, you are working to make your constituency, your community, a better place, and to leave it better than when you found it. And my hope is that everyone is doing that.
Yeah, that would be my hope too. And I know there are different pathways and different values to that. And we're not all like, we're not going to agree on some of that stuff across party lines, but that's okay, as long as that is actually the driving force for people.
Yeah, I think, it's so interesting because, people will, it's so common in politics, they'll say, I'm doing this for my children and, future generations. And, like, but what does that actually mean? But also, what ideology and what are your belief systems that are feeding into that? Because that's actually, that's the substantial difference between, political parties and why you might elect, an NDP MLA versus a PC MLA. It's because they come at it from different positions. And so, how do we, it's just, this is like the messy social side of politics, that, I want people to think about and talk about more often, because I think also this kind of, like, we have to talk about these things in order for them to change, and to maybe even give people more permission, to advocate for those different things. So, yeah.
Yeah. Just like nodding and agreeing with you, forgetting that we're not
on video.
There's no
video. It's only audio. Nodding is definitely silent. But yeah, there's just so much work to do. And I think it's about having people at the table who are willing to do the work, and to, who understand the need that it needs to happen now.
Yeah. And I agree with you. And that I'm a hard worker, and I have always wanted to work and been passionate about community change. But back in the day, it was like just showing up at every protest and trying to, volunteering for all the organizations that I believed in. And it took a few decades for me to understand the power in electoral politics and the ability, where I could help, one person or two people with the work that I was doing, that policy could change the lives for thousands or more, So that's what I would say to any woman thinking about getting into politics, is that, if you have a vision, you have a belief in how things can be, that this is the table to like make that happen.
That's a really important point. And going back to, how we started the conversation talking about, that issue that you had at your child's school, and, that, you advocated for something and it changed. And now hopefully, any other child that passes through that same program doesn't have that same issue. So, hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of children will be impacted by that policy change.
And that was just my advocacy of writing a letter, right?
Yes.
But when I did serve as school trustee, the policy that people most associate with me is that we developed outside of Toronto the first kind of comprehensive policy in the school division to support trans and non-binary kids, that covered everything from overnight camps to field trips to bathrooms. And I like it. To date, it's still, my greatest policy pride, I guess, because we did a really good job on that work and on consultation. And in 2015, passed this incredible bill that's now, most of the things in that policy are now being have now been integrated across the province and other school divisions. And it doesn't feel groundbreaking anymore because things have moved so rapidly in that area. But I know, I've met young adults now who were affected by that policy 6-7 years ago, right? And they tell me that, and that means everything. And it really, really showed me what was possible.
Well, we need more change. We need more Lisa Naylors in politics. It just can't happen soon enough. So.
Thank you very much, Sarah.
Yeah, you're
delightful
welcome.
talking to you, and not just
I know
shopping.
I've kept you much longer than I said. I was like, well, I'll do a stop at this, but we've gone beyond just because the conversation was like, it was really lovely to have. So I really appreciate you sharing your time with me and for talking with me today. And I am trying to figure out a way to come to Manitoba.
Well, when I get to Calgary next, I will definitely stop in and say hello. I have family in Edmonton, or my in-laws are in Edmonton, but sometimes I get out there. So
yeah. That would be lovely. I'd love to meet you in person. So thank you so much for today.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks.